We're back on another episode of the Alamu Series Podcast. Before we go into today's very interesting and thought-provoking topic, how did you find last week's episode of the Alamu Series? That's Ajegunle Love. My own personal take about it, it's not much really. I just feel that Alamu and Nkechi's love story. It's not like the common mushy kind of love story that we're used to. For me, the love between them, the romance between them, seem more like something toxic. Really, it doesn't look like it's that too mutual. And well, for me, the more toxic, the more dramatic. Yeah, so I'm hoping to see more on their love story, and I hope you are too, because it's going to get very dramatic, really. Yeah, those two characters appear at a serious height. Yeah, for today's topic, we talked about lifting the veil. How easy is it to create African comics? Let me try and simplify things at the beginning, because we need to do that before we dive into the topic. Um, in this discourse or in this podcast today, we are not talking about, because there are two kinds of African creators. There are African creators and storytellers creating comics within the shores of Africa. And there are African creators and storytellers creating comics in diaspora. Now, in this discourse, we are not looking at African creators outside the shores of Africa. We are looking at African comic creators within the shores of Africa. And that's because if you've ever been a creator within the shores of Africa, you will know that creating comics as an African creator within Africa is a total different ball game from being an African creator in diaspora. Take it from me. When you talk about the Western comic industry, for instance, through which African creator in diaspora leverage on to a large extent, you're talking about an industry that has close to a century of ecosystem building. That's no joke. That's a lot. And that will lead me to us looking at the first point we're going to be looking at in the question. Because when you say, how easy is it to make African comics? You're simply talking about the challenges of creating African comics within the African terrain. Basically, that's it. So now let's look at markets and infrastructure. That's a tough one. Now, let's look at it from the Western angle, then we come back to the African angle. It's better that way. It makes us to simplify things. While we are not trying to juxtapose things as the case may be, we are just trying to look at the well-developed angle and then look at the challenges we have around there and try to navigate around it, basically. Now, for the Western, comic industry, for instance, where they have a well-developed distribution network, you have a comic conventions, you have a comic shops, you have the digital platforms, and you have the licensing pipelines. Basically, for instance, when I relocated, I've been making comics in Africa, Nigeria for I think close to 3 decades now. So that's quite some time. Now, but when I relocated recently to the United Kingdom, I got some shock. Now I won't tell you that until let's first get to how it is like in the African terrain now. We will use Nigeria as a blueprint because I spent all my life creating comics, majorly in Nigeria, Africa, West Africa. When it comes to distribution, when it comes to comic conventions, when it comes to comic shops, how is it like in Africa? For instance, from where I come from in Nigeria, back 5 years ago, we used to have it still exists now. We used to have the Lagos Comic Con, which takes place in Lagos every year. I think there wasn't really any year I basically missed it because, I mean, I always look forward to it every year. And that's how excited I am, I'm a comic fanatic, you know. But then you would think that, that's something. But if we look at that compared to the geometric, to the geographical mass of a country, for me, it's a drop in an ocean, because Nigeria has 36 states, and then we have the Federal Capital Territory, making 37, in all. And all of this, we just have one comic convention in a year. Recently, it got to be better, because then we had a comic convention in Oyo State, Ibadan. Then I think there's a comic expo that started this year. Then I think I heard about another state that is trying to, create a comic con. And I think there is about 2 or 3 comic activities as well in several areas of Lagos. If we had everything together, we don't have more than, let's roughly say, like 6 comic conventions or activities in the year within 36, 37 states. That's poor. It's not, don't let me make it seem like it's so bad. But I'm just saying, when I came here, for instance, to the United Kingdom, and I was trying to research on the comic conventions and all that they have around there. And just within a county, the different 3-4 areas within where I am, I discovered that within 3 months, they have close to 12 comic conventions. I was shocked. I couldn't bring myself to understand how within 3 months they were going to have 10 comic conventions. In Cheltenham, there were conventions. In Gloucestershire, there were conventions. In name it. And that's different from the big London Comic Convention. That's one is another one on its own entirely. And of course, you know that this is where a lot of indie comic creators get to show off their craft, basically. So what happens to me in Nigeria is that I save up my money, because there are some comics, if I don't see them in the comic convention, I never get to see them again throughout the year. So I just pile up my money and know that, okay, when I'm going to comic convention this year, I'm going to get all the titles that I need to get, basically. Now, what of comic shops? While I was in Nigeria, I never recall seeing any comic shops per se, really. And that's not, too impressive when it comes to access to comics, distribution networks. It's not too impressive. The game changed a bit when I came to the United Kingdom, because just a stone throw from my house, I walk into Waterstones and get any comic of my choice. Yes, Waterstone is more like a big bookshop, but they have a massive space dedicated only to comics, graphic novels, and all kinds of comics. And even if I go there and the comic is in their online store, I could order, either they drop it for me at home, or I get to pick it in the store. I think I still bought Black Panther, the latest release, from the store some time ago. That's the advantage of comic store. And so almost even libraries as well. The last time I borrowed them, I borrowed Spider-Man, I borrowed Batman, then I borrowed Daredevil, Born Again in the library. The accessibility is easier. And that's one key challenge that, creation of comics in Africa is facing, the infrastructure, basically, because it's one thing for you to create your comics. It's another thing for you to be able to get it out there easily. Now, you may talk about the digital discourse is a different ballgame entirely, which I want to separate from today. The truth is, you cannot take away the hard copy prints. Even in well-developed countries, they still have comic shops where you work, because I'm a collector, I'm a comic collector. And you can't take away the beauty of going to buy the hard copy. Despite the digital development and advancement, basically. So there has to be access to these things. So that's a big issue in comic creation in Africa, which I feel that maybe over time we will be able to navigate through. I'm hoping that in my country, Nigeria, for instance, the comic conventions will grow better as time goes on, and we won't just have 2 or 3 or 4 in well over 36 states, which is very limited. Yeah. That said, let's go to another key aspect of creating African creators, creating comics within the shores of Africa, and that's the issue of funding and sustainability. Take it or leave it, funding is a big issue in any business. For any entrepreneur, for any business person, funding is a big deal. But let's go to the context of comic creation and then narrow it down to Africa. How is the issue of funding and how is the issue of sustainability in relation to the funding? In the West, in the Western world, I think it's just a bit better, because there's access to grants. There's access to, because some of these grants are tied to locations. I've seen grants that they say that you have to be in this country, you have to be in that country to be able to access it. So some of these grants are location specific, And so people within some of these Western geographical locations have access to these grants. Then there's access to angel investors. There's access to crowdfunding. Again, is another aspect. And crowdfunding could have been maybe a way to go about this thing. While I was in Nigeria, I would watch and see a lot of my colleagues abroad in different parts of the world kickstart their work on Kickstarter, launch their work on Kickstarter and fund it that way. But in the West, for instance, countries like the United Kingdom, the US, Canada, Australia, a large part of Europe, and even South Africa have access to launch their comic works on Kickstarter to get it funded, to crowdfund it. But let's come to Africa a bit and see how the picture is. Countries like Nigeria, countries like Ghana, countries like Kenya, countries like Egypt, etc., cannot launch a comic project on Kickstarter directly. I don't know whether to use the word disqualified. And that's painful. The only way through which some of my colleagues have been able to do this that I have seen is when they collaborate with creators, maybe other African creators in countries where there are no restrictions, maybe countries like the US, maybe countries like the United Kingdom and all that. And that's how they get it. But of course, again, there are a bit of modalities to these things. Because if you are going to collaborate with a creator, and the creator has not probably done Kickstarter before, has not run a successful Kickstarter before, that itself becomes a challenge. Because you have to have the mailing list. You have to have, maybe if he has a mailing list you can leverage on, dedicated followership. You ought to have probably been able to support other Kickstarters. Because this is how the game plays. When you support other Kickstarters that run their campaign, when you are doing yours, they are able and willing to use their network to share your project on their platforms. That way, you get the news out about a project. So if you are even going to collaborate, it's not just about collaborating, but collaborating with somebody that understands the game. Otherwise, it's a campaign that is dead on arrival. So the followership is there, the mailing list is there, the fact that the person you are partnering with must understand the nitty-gritties of running a campaign on Kickstarter. It's also there. So that's probably the only way out for creators within the shores of Africa to launch a Kickstarter. Outside that, they're disqualified. And then that's painful, really. Indiegogo is not as strict as Kickstarter. But the only problem with Indiegogo again with Africa is that the payment model, which uses either PayPal or Stripe, has restrictions in various African countries, with the exception of South Africa, though. And that will, of course, pose a challenge again to running a successful Indiegogo campaign to crowdfund your work if you're within Africa. And you know one thing about this crowdfunding thing is that I know of colleagues, African creators abroad, who have over and over and over again funded their projects on Kickstarter, and through that they broke into mainstream, which is not a bad idea. It's a very good and brilliant idea. So at times, structures like crowdfunding, Kickstarters, Indiegogo are needed to help indie creators. But within Africa, comics within Africa has that challenge. I heard of one of my colleagues say something like, when it comes to comic, you have to be consistent. You cannot create a comic in January and then come back in October and create a comic. I agree and I disagree. I agree in the sense that, yes, you have to be consistent. But I disagree in the sense that if you produce a comic in January, you don't make profit, you don't have money to reproduce, you don't have access to crowdfund, how do you go back to produce another? It takes money to run some of these things, even to create. To create it alone, if you are a creator, because you need to get expertise. The artist, the colorist, the writer, it takes money. And so if you are not getting access to probably an angel investor or crowdfunding avenues or any of these things, how do you want to run it? So it poses a big challenge. Yeah, of course, I know that there are crowdfunding platforms. There is the Mchanga in Kenya. There is the Niger Funds in Nigeria. The only thing just two problems with these platforms, is that they are not comic creator focused. They are more of the general crowdfunding platforms. So it could be, a bit of a limitation. That's one. Number two is the fact that they don't have the global reach of platforms like Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and that's in itself a limitation. I know that there was a time a veteran in the industry in Nigeria called me and said, look, Ayo, maybe it's time that we begin to look at how we can also create our own crowdfunding platforms so that creators can get their work out there. And well, it's the truth. Maybe Africa, pending collaborations, because not everybody will be able to, get these collaborations outside the shores of Africa. And that's the truth. Not everybody. So for people who don't have that advantage, I feel maybe it's time for Africa to begin to look at a crowdfunding platform that is focused solely towards supporting African creators to get their work out there, so that we are not cut short by the outside world. Yes, we have Netflix and the global platform, but we have Showmax in South Africa. You know, that's on the movie angle. So if we are having crowdfunding for comics in Africa, I mean, Africa, it's talking about a billion. How many billion are we in Africa? We should be able to create a platform to support our work and put it out there. I feel so. I'm passionate about that. Another angle, is, creators. Well, for this will require expertise. If they can maybe do blockchain crowdfunding, because crypto will always bypass limitations like PayPal and Stripe and all that. But of course, that one will require expertise, basically. So these are the challenges, when it comes to funding and the sustainability. And then you talk about even the cost of printing and the purchasing power. I mean, if you back then, before I left Nigeria, I think I was buying a comic for, let's say 3,000 naira. I can't imagine how much a graphic novel would be. Maybe we'll be talking of 10, 15,000. Which you will ask the question, how many comic fans can afford that? I think that's a silly question to ask. Here in the UK, we buy graphic novels, £15, £10, and it's really not a big deal. But then printing and purchasing power is also a big issue in Africa, which the comic creator will always be at the receiving end, because he is the one sourcing for the funds and putting the money out there, basically. Let's go to another very important subject or subtopic under this issue of challenges that African creatives face within the African shores in creating of comics. Let's look at the audience. And in audience, we talk about familiarity and the reading culture. Now, you know that when you talk about the Western world, a lot of these people literally grew up with a lot of these comics. For instance, Black Panther. Yeah, I got to know about Black Panther. To be very frank, I got to know about Black Panther in 2018. But it will shock some people to know that Black Panther had been in existence since 1966. And titles like superheroes like Captain America, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Daredevil, these characters were not today. They go way back. And which means or implies that a lot of these are mainstream in the West. Which is why you can see a lot of fans that can pumping a lot of money just to follow episode after episode of the Incredible Hulk, of Thor, and name it. But when you come down to Africa, I think the situation only got just recently better. Maybe some 5, 6, 7 years. Because I would remember way back in 2010, when I wanted to publish a comic, and I just wanted it to be via publishing house so that it could save me some, stress of distribution and all that. And I will recall very well what the publisher said to me. I can't. It stayed with me for that long, since 2010. He said to me, "You have a good story. I've gone through your work, but why comics? This is for children. You are using a wrong medium to tell the right story." And that broke my heart. Because really comics, there are comics that could be for kindergarten. But comic, as it is or should be, is a medium of entertainment. And so you could have comics for mature minds that is not just for kids of 6 years, 7 years and all that, basically. Yeah. So that's a big challenge in Africa, which I feel is getting better, but it will take some time, And because it's not mainstream, The challenge we're having is that other mediums of entertainment that are mainstream are overshadowing the relevance of a medium like comics. Say the music industry, say sports, film industry in Nigeria, we talk about Nollywood. These strong mediums of entertainment, are overshadowing a medium like comics, basically. And we shouldn't be. So the audience and reading culture, it's a big, big issue in Africa at the moment, which I am hoping and I am expecting that in years to come will get better. Lastly, let's look at cultural representation. Interesting point. Now, because when you talk cultural representation in the West, for instance, the archetypes, the nose gods, and the mythologies that probably have global, the Greek mythologies now, and all these things are more popular in mainstream. And then the American ideals that are given prominence to by the dominance of Hollywood in the world. These are globally recognized stuffs. But when you come to Africa, the African comic creator is faced with the challenge of the African mythology, the African folklores, and the contemporary stories and socio-political stories, presenting them in an authentic way to Africa, making it authentic. But then, in a way, you're also asked to make them appeal to the global audience. So it has that challenge. So why keeping it authentic? But it has to have a global appeal, because the global people within the global sphere may not be familiar with some of these things. And so you have to make it appealing to them. And the best way to navigate this is that when you are probably, creating your work, creating your story, you bring some elements from the world, add it to it, in a way that can make it appealing on a global pedestal. And you could also decide to merge, probably folklores from different countries, different African countries. For instance, there was a time I think I wrote in Jerry that I wrote was even Kenyan. People didn't even know that I was Nigerian while I was writing something within that sphere, basically. So one just has to tell an authentic African story in a global way to make it acceptable. But then again, I think, in my personal opinion, that the world is becoming a global village, and there are a lot of Africans in diaspora. Now, you go to Canada, go to America, go to the United Kingdom, go to Australia, even Japan. There are a lot of African readers in all these places that are hungry for authentic African content. So the key is, when you create, you are not just creating for Africa alone. You are creating for the consumption of the world. So if you as an African creator can solve the problem of distribution, and these works can get outside there to the world, trust me, you already have audience. You already have fans that are waiting to read these stuff. So I would say this, that African creators have some of the most richest content in terms of cultural aesthetics. And if the distribution can be innovatively navigated and the issue of funding is also resolved, I am more than confident that African comics created within Africa will scale globally. That's what I think. Yeah, so that will be all for today. Trust you enjoyed the podcast today. Feel free to drop your comments in the comment section. I'll look forward to reading your comment, and trust me, every comment will be responded to. Drop your comments, let's chat. Drop your comments, let's brainstorm together, let's learn. Next week we'll be having another Alamu series titled Missing. It's a bit cryptic, so I won't be able to give much away about that. But trust me, you're going to enjoy the episodes. If you don't enjoy it, come back and drop a comment and tell me you didn't enjoy this episode. It's going to be fun, really. For the next podcast, I'm still cooking. I won't give you the topic yet, but it's going to be dynamite when it drops. Till then, take good care of yourself and don't stop writing, don't stop creating. See you. Bye.